Peace and love. Welcome back to the channel and a warm welcome to our new viewers. Today we dive into another powerful part of history that shaped our world. If you're a returner, thank you for your continued support. Your engagement helps us keep these stories alive. And for those joining us for the first time, you've come to the right place to uncover untold truths and hidden stories. As we explore this image, it's a chilling story, but don't forget to hit that like, comment, and subscribe. Your voice matters, and together we can shed light on the past to better understand the present. Let's get into it. Peace and love.
On behalf of Akuno Call for Bay, you know what I'm saying? Jay, where you at? We're trying to help our people elevate. Hope. H-O-P-E. We're giving them hope. We doing what we gotta do, you know? Every day, one step at a time, man. We gonna make it happen. Helping our people elevate. Yeah. Sometimes I practice focus, thought, and meditate. I'm trying to come with other ways to help our people elevate and seeking knowledge, make me levitate. The lifted mental state is what results from how we orchestrate. This for the family's sake. Let's self-reflect and self-evaluate. And every day, make sure the steps you take, you calculate. Receive a master's fate. I know I can't exist without the hate, but that's okay. I balance that with higher self today. Success is on this way, and after that, my flesh can pass away.
The massacre of black sharecroppers that led to the Supreme Court to curb the racial disparities of the justice system. White Arkansans, fearful of what would happen if African Americans organized, took violent action, but it was the victims who ended up standing trial. This is an image of the Elaine defendants, Helena, Phillip County, Arkansas, in 1910. The sharecroppers who gathered at the church in Elaine, Arkansas, in the late hours of September 30th, 1919, knew the risk they were taking. Upset about their low wages, they enlisted the help of a prominent white attorney from Little Rock, Ulysses Bratton, to come to Elaine to press a fairer share in the profit of their labor. Each season, landowners came around demanding obscene percentages of the profits without ever presenting the sharecroppers detailing accounts and trapping them with supposed debts. There was very little recourse for African American tenant farmers against this exploitation. Instead, there was an unwritten law that no African Americans could leave until his or her debt was paid off, writes Megan Mean Francis in Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State. Organizers hoped Bratton's presence would bring more pressure to bear through the courts. Aware of the dangers, the atmosphere was tense after racially motivated violence in the area. Some of the farmers were armed with rifles. Around 11 p.m. that night, a group of local white men, some of whom had been affiliated with local law enforcement, fired shots into the church. The shots were returned, and in the chaos, one white man was killed. Word spread rapidly about the death. Rumors arose that the sharecroppers who had formerly joined a union known as the Progressive Farmers and Household Unions of America were leading an organized insurrection against the white residents of Phillips County. Governor Charles Broke called for 500 soldiers from nearby Camp Pikes to, as the Arkansas Democrats reported on October 2nd, round up heavily armed Negroes. The troops were under order to shoot and kill any Negro who refused to surrender immediately. They went well beyond that, banding together with local vigilantes and killing at least 200 African Americans. Estimates run much more higher, but there was never a full accounting. And the killing was indiscriminate. Men, women, and children, unfortunate enough to be in the vicinity, were slaughtered. Amidst the violence, 5 whites died. But for those deaths, someone would have to be held accountable. Out of this tragedy, known as the Elaine Massacre, and the subsequent prosecution, will come a Supreme Court decision that would upend years of court-sanctioned injustice against African Americans and would secure the rights of due process for defendants placed in impossible circumstances. This was the attorney, Ulysses Simpson Bratton. Despite its impact, little about the carnage in Elaine was unique during the summer of 1919. It was a part of a period of a vicious reprisal against African American veterans returning home from World War I. Many whites believed that these veterans, including Robert Hill, who co-founded the PFHUA, posed a threat as they claimed greater recognition for their rights at home. Even though they served in large numbers, black soldiers realized over the course of the war and in the immediate aftermath that their achievements and their success actually provoked more rage and more vitriol than if they had uttered failed, says Adrian Lynch Smith, associate professor in history of Duke University and the author of Freedmen's Struggle, African Americans in World War I. During the massacre, Arkansan Leroy Johnston, who had spent 9 months recovering in the hospital from injuries he suffered in the trenches of France, was pulled from the train shortly after returning home and shot to death alongside his 3 brothers. In places like Phillip County, where the economy directly depended on predatory systems of sharecropping, white residents were inclined to view the activities of Hills and others at least in a series of dangerous agitations. In the days after the bloodshed in Elaine, local media coverage continued to fan the flames daily, reporting sensational stories of an organized plot against whites. A 7-man committee formed to investigate the killings. Their conclusions all too predictable. The following week, they issued a statement in the Arkansas Democrat declaring the gathering in Elaine a deliberately planned insurrection of the Negroes against the whites led by the PFHUA, whose founder used an ignorance and superstitions of a race of children for monetary gains. The The paper claimed that every individual who joined was under the understanding that ultimately he would be called upon to kill white people. A week later, they would congratulate themselves on the whole episode and their ability to restore order, confidently claiming that no one slain African American was innocent. The real secret of Phillips County's success, the newspaper boasted, is that the Southerners know the Negroes through several generations of experience. To counter this accepted narrative, Walter White, a member of the NAACP, whose appearance enabled him to blend in with the white residents, snuck into Phillips County by posing as a reporter. In subsequent articles, he claimed that the careful examination does not reveal the dastardly plot which had been charged, and that indeed the PFHUA had no design of an uprising. He pointed out the disparity in death tolls alone bellied the accepted version of events. With African Americans making up a significant majority of local residents, it appears that the fatalities would have been differently proportioned if a well-planned murder plot had existed among the Negroes, he wrote in The Nation. The NAACP also pointed out in the publication The Crisis that in the prevailing climate of the unchecked lynching and mob violence against African Americans, none would be fool enough to do so. The black press picked up the story, and other papers began to integrate white counter-narratives into their accounts, galvanizing support for the defendants.
We were really afraid.
At 107 years old, Juanita Mitchell has no trouble remembering how Chicago erupted into violence.
And we hid behind the piano in my aunt's house.
Mitchell was just 7 years old in July of 1919 during the Red Summer a century ago. She just had moved to Chicago with her mother and sister and was staying on the South Side with her Uncle Cecil when the unrest began.
I could hear my uncle saying, "Here they come." And when he said, "Here they come," it meant the white folks were coming.
The Red Summer of 1919. This Saturday marks 100 years since the Chicago race riot that began on July 27th and ended on August 3rd, 1919. In this photo essay, CHM Assistant Curator Julius L. Jones recounts the events of that Tulsa week, as well as the legacy of activism that came from it. All images are from the collection of the Chicago History Museum. Warning, the fifth image is graphic in nature. Viewer discretion is advised. On Sunday, July 27, 1919, thousands of Chicagoans saw relief from the brutal heat on the shores of Lake Michigan. Among them was Eugene Williams, a 17-year-old African-American. When he and his friends inadvertently drifted across an invisible line that divided the waters by race, a group of whites, insulted by such an act, began throwing stones at him, one of which struck Williams, causing him to drown. In the racial power cave of Chicago, his murder was the spark that ignited it during what became the Red Summer of 1919. And this image is an image of white and Negroes leaving 26th Street Beach after the drowning of Eugene Williams. After the drowning of Eugene Williams, the police refused to arrest the white man who was considered responsible for his death. As the crowd grew, the tensions escalated, and the fight began. The violence that started at the beach spread throughout Chicago's Black Belt on the south side, especially in residential areas surrounding the Union Stockyard. The front page of the Chicago Defender of August 2nd, 1919, announced the turmoil in the city and listed the names of all those who were slain and injured. The police force, owing both to understaffing and the open sympathy to many officers with the white rioters, was in effect only the long-delayed intervention of the Illinois National Guards brought the violence to a halt. 2 white men stoned an African-American man during a riot. White gangs initially went into black neighborhoods to wreak havoc. Riots ranged from children to adults. Here, a group stands in and around a home that was vandalized and looted. The riot's legacy: after 7 days of shooting, arson, and beating, the race riot resulted in the death of 15 whites and 23 blacks, with an additional 537 injured, 195 whites and 342 blacks. Since then, a century of African-American activism has challenged the racism and social hypocrisy that allowed those responsible for Eugene Williams' death to elude justice. Activists continue to fight against racial discrimination in Chicago and the United States. The aftermath of World War II saw a revival of white attacks on African Americans. Here, 2 men at 31st Street and Cottage Grove Avenue stand next to a sign for Riot Against Lynching, August of 1946. Protests throughout the 1940s and 50s sought to break down racial barriers in housing, public accommodations, and recreational activities. This one took place at the White City Roller Rink, 63rd Street and South Parkway, renamed Martin Luther King Drive in 1968, Chicago, 1946. In the 1960s, the Chicago community of Ashburn saw significant racial strife over school desegregation. This open house march took place near Bogan High School, August 12, 1966.
John, the Knoxville race riots lasted about 48 hours, and it all started when a man was arrested for a crime many say he didn't commit.
All that's left of Knoxville's racial past are clippings and word of mouth.
As history records, it becomes one of the bloodiest, sort of most violent parts of our history with respect to race relations.
with Maurice Mays.
There's all these questions surrounding who Maurice Mays really was.
He was a business owner, politically active, and at one point, sheriff. But historians say he was also known to bend the rules.
There was the understanding that there was a white police officer, a couple who had always vowed to get Maurice Mays back. You know, that I don't know who he thinks he is, but we're gonna deal with him.
And that's where trouble for Mays begins.
The story goes that supposedly this African-American male has killed this white female.
Knoxville Race Riot in 1919. The Knoxville Race Riot in Knoxville, Tennessee was one of the several race riots that took place in the Red Summer of 1919. The so-called Red Summer of 1919 was a series of violent riots, predominantly white against blacks, which lasted from May until October of that year and resulted in an estimate of 600 deaths across the nation. The riots began on October 30th, 1919, when an intruder entered the home of Bertie Lindsay, a 27-year-old white woman, and shot her while she was sleeping in her bed. The only witness was Lindsay's 21-year-old cousin, Ora Smith, who soon after the intruder left their Knoxville home, stealing a purse on his way out, ran next door to the house of a city policeman. One of the officers investigating the crime scene, Andy White, immediately accused Maurice Mays. Maurice Franklin Mays was a well-known African-American political figure who briefly served as a deputy sheriff in North Knoxville. Afterwards, however, Mays spent much of his time gambling, bootlegging, and managing a strollers cafe on East Jackson Avenue, located in Knoxville's red light district. At about 6 months old, Maurice Franklin Mays became the foster child of William Mays, a former slave, and his wife, Frances Mays. Mays' biological father was the white Democratic mayor, John E. McMillan. Ella Walker, Mays' biological mother, worked as McMillan's maid. On October 30th at 3:30 a.m., Andy White, along with two officers, traveled to Mays' apartment where they found a revolver in his dresser. Soon after, White handcuffed Mays and hauled him over to the crime scene where Ora Smith identified him as the intruder after barely glancing at Mays. Maurice Franklin Mays was then taken to the Knox County jailhouse. At around 8 a.m. the next morning, angry whites began to congregate near the Knox County jail. A few individuals broke into the jail to search for Mays. However, he was moved to a jail located in Chattanooga, Tennessee, as a protective measure. No African-American inmates were harmed during their search, but over a dozen white inmates were freed, leading to the pillaging of the liquor storage room and the demolition of the jail. Later that day, the National Guardsmen were notified about several holdups taking place in the black section of Knoxville near Vine Avenue and Central Street by a band of African Americans. Not long after, a detachment was sent to the scene, followed by a mob of white rioters. Although only one business was broken into by African Americans, the white mob raided and destroyed numerous black-owned businesses in the area. Eventually, guardsmen joined the mob, engaging in gunfire with black residents. In the end, hundreds of citizens were wounded and several people were killed, 6 blacks and 1 white. The riot prompted many African Americans to flee the city. Although the Knoxville riot of 1919 started as a murder case and not as a race riot, in the end, it became one. Maurice Franklin Mays was convicted of the murder of Bertie Lindsay by an all-white juror and sentenced to death. On March 15, 1922, in Nashville, Tennessee, Maurice Franklin Mays was pronounced dead after being sentenced to an electric chair. He was 35 years old.
Ocoee was a rural community that would have been pretty familiar to people living in Central Florida at the time, in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it was, a community lined with orange groves and agricultural productions, and it was near Orlando, which was a transportation hub. The railroad came through Orlando. Farmers in Ocoee could go to Orlando and send their goods to market. And so it had a very desirable place, just geography, because it was so close to a railroad hub.
The Ocoee Massacre of 1920. The Ocoee Massacre, which occurred in the town of Ocoee, Florida, on November 2nd and 3rd of 1920, was the largest election-related massacre of the 20th century. Approximately 50 blacks and 2 whites died in the violence, and the entire black community of Ocoee was forced to flee the town. Ocoee, Florida, in Orange County, approximately 12 miles northwest of Orlando, had been politically dominated by conservative Democrats since the end of the Reconstruction. They prided themselves on keeping blacks, then mostly Republicans, from the polls. In 1920, a number of black organizations across Florida began conducting voters registration campaigns. Partly because of their efforts, a prosperous black farmer, Mose Norman, who had been part of the voters registration drive in Orange County, decided to vote in the national election on November 2nd. When he attempted to do so twice, he was turned away from the polls. When Norman was driven away the second time, a white mob, then numbering over 100 men, decided to hunt him down. Concluding he had taken refuge in the home of another local black resident, Julius July Perry, they rushed Perry's home, hoping to capture both men there. Norman escaped and was never found while Perry was defending his home, killing 2 white men, Elmer McDaniels and Leo Borgard, who tried to enter through the back door. The mob called for reinforcements from Orlando and surrounding Orange County. Eventually, they caught and killed Perry and hung his dead body from a telephone post by the highway from Ocoee to intimidate other potential black voters. Perry's wife, Estelle Perry, and their daughter were wounded during the attack on the Perry's home. They were sent to Tampa by local law enforcement officers. The mob then turned on the black community of Ocoee. They burned down homes and businesses and demanded that the black residents leave Ocoee. In the face of this threatened violence, the entire African-American population fled the town. Some African-Americans speculated that the riots may have been planned so that some of the whites could seize the property of the wealthiest blacks in the town. The NAACP investigated the massacre, sending Walter White, the organization's executive director. White, who passed as a Caucasian during his visit, reported that some local whites were still giddy with victory when he arrived. He also said that the locals reported 56 blacks killed, but he claimed 30 deaths in his official report. In 1921, the NAACP and other civil rights organizations called on the House of Election Committee of the U.S. Congress to investigate the massacre and black voter suppression in Florida, but it failed to act. On July 21, 2019, a historical marker honoring July Perry and others killed in the massacre was placed in Heritage Square outside the Orange County Regional History Center.
This is Ocoee Cemetery here in Tulsa, where it was long believed that there were 18 black men from the Tulsa riot who were killed, who were buried here, but no one could ever find their bodies. The people who are buried here one day walked out of their home, disappeared, and were never seen again.
May 31st to June 1st, 1921. On the morning of May 30th, 1921, a young black man named Dick Rowland was riding in an elevator on the Drexel building at 3rd and Main with a white woman named Sarah Page. The details of what followed varies from person to person. Accounts of the incident circulated among the city's white community during the day and became more exaggerated with each telling. Tulsa police arrested Rowland the following day and began an investigation. An inflammatory report in the May 31st edition of Tulsa Tribune spurred a confrontation between black and white armed mobs around the courthouse, where the sheriff and his men had barricaded the top floor to protect Rowland. Shots were fired, and the outnumbered African Americans began retreating to the Greenwood district. In the early morning hours of June 1st, 1921, Greenwood was looted and burned by white rioters. Governor Robertson declared martial law, and National Guard troops arrived in Tulsa. Guardsmen assisted firemen in putting out fires, took African Americans out of the hands of vigilantes, and imprisoned all black Tulsans not already interned. Over 6,000 people were held at the convention hall and the fairgrounds, some for as long as 8 days. 24 hours after violence erupted, it ceased. In the wake of the violence, 35 city blocks lay in charred ruins. More than 800 people were treated for injuries, and contemporary reports of deaths began at 36. Historians now believe as many as 300 people may have died. In order to understand the Tulsa Race Massacre, it is important to understand the complicities of the times. Dick Rowland, Sarah Page, and an unknown gunman were the spark that ignited a long, smoldering fire. Those who know it, the unknown gunman was Tom Brady. Jim Crow, jealousy, white supremacy, and land lust all played roles in leading up to the destruction and loss of lives on May 31st and June 1st, 1921.
They was kind of like the role models, and they was leading by example.
During the massacre, a white man named J.W. Wright, who allowed some of the black women and children, no boys over 13, to hide in his house during the daytime to escape this mob. And late the second or third night, he allowed the train came in on this railroad track at night quietly and loaded these people up. And the depot was right behind his property. And the train took these people to Gainesville and saved their lives.
On the first day of 1923, white vigilante mobs began their descent upon the predominantly black community of Rosewood, Florida. In an attack that would last several days, they shoot and beat black residents, set buildings aflame, and razed the small but prosperous mill towns that was home of approximately 200 people. Earlier that day, Fannie Taylor, a white resident of Summer, a nearby North Florida town, had been heard screaming in her home. When her neighbor arrived, Tabor, visibly beaten, claimed that a black man had assaulted her. They reported the alleged attack to the sheriff, and James Taylor, Fannie's husband, gathered a mob of whites to search for a black man who might be his wife's assailant. According to the official 1993 Florida State report on the incident, some from the local community recount that a white man, possibly a lover, was seen visiting Fannie Taylor that morning. Some speculate that he may have been the one who assaulted her, and that she fabricated the story of a black assailant to hide her affair. The sheriff's office, without evidence, had already chosen a suspect, Jesse Hunter, a black prisoner who had recently escaped the chain gang. Under the guise of finding Hunter, white mob staged a multi-day attack on Rosewood. They torched all the town's homes and churches, shot at residents fleeing the blazes, held firefights with residents defending their homes, and lynched several men they accused of harboring Hunter. Many Rosewood residents fled in terror, often just in their night clothes, to nearby swamps to hide from their mobs. With some estimates ranging higher, the official death count included at least 6 black residents and 2 white attackers. As news of what was occurring in Rosewood spread, falsely casting the town's black residents as instigators, more white men joined the violent mobs, including Ku Klux Klan members. Some black residents were able to escape via a train to Gainesville. The story of the Rosewood Massacre was largely ignored until 1982, when a St. Petersburg Times reporter wrote a series of articles about its history. This led the town's remaining survivors, in their old age, to demand restitution from the state. In 1994, the Florida state legislature passed a bill that allotted the non-living survivors $150,000 each, with significantly smaller sums to descendants' families, just half of whom received more than $2,000. The bill also established a scholarship for Rosewood descendants to receive a Florida State University, college, or post-secondary education free of tuition. The bill is considered the first of its kind. No legislative body in the U.S. has previously given reparations to black people. In 1997, director John Singleton dramatized the massacre in his 1997 film Rosewood.
In 100 places, Detroit is afire. 100 square blocks are now under siege. And as you walk through the area, people shout from their homes, "Watch out for the snipers."
The 1967 Detroit riots were among the most violent and destructive riots in United States history. By the time the bloodshed, burning, and looting ended after 5 days, 43 people were dead, 342 injured. Nearly 1,400 buildings have been burned, and some 7,000 National Guards and U.S. Army troops have been called into service. In the sweltering summer of 1967, Detroit's predominantly African-American neighborhood of Virginia Park was a simmering cauldron of racial tension. About 60,000 low-income residents were crammed into a neighborhood's 460 acres, living mostly in small, subdivided apartments. The Detroit Police Department, which had only 50 African-American officers at the time, was viewed as a white occupying army. Accusations of racial profiling and police brutality were commonplace among Detroit's black residents. The only other whites in Virginia Park commuted in from the suburbs to run their businesses on 12th Street, then commuted home to affluent enclaves outside Detroit. The entire city was in a state of economic and social strife as the Motor City famed automobile industry shed jobs and moved out of the city center, freeways and suburban amenities, backbone middle-class residents away, which further gutted Detroit's vitality and left behind vacant storefronts, widespread unemployment, and impoverished despair. A similar scenario played out at the metropolitan acres across America, where white flight reduced the tax base in formerly prosperous cities, causing urban blight, poverty, and racial discord. In mid-July 1967, the city of Newark, New Jersey erupted in violence as black residents battled police following the beating of a black taxi driver, leaving 26 people dead. And I'm dropping jewels on y'all from the 1800s, and we in the 1967s now. And so this ain't nothing changed in today's times. Police brutality still goes on. They still try to keep us from being equal. They still try to keep there's so much I can go into, but I'm going to just keep reading because I do this for y'all to just think about what they went through then. It's the same stuff we're going through today. At night, 12th Street in Detroit was a hotspot for inner city nightlife, both legal and illegal. At the corner of 12th and Claremont, William Scott operated a Blind Pig, an illegal after-hours club, on weekends out of the office of the United Community League of Civil Action, a civil rights group. The police vice squad then raided establishments like this on 12th Street, and at 3:35 a.m. on Sunday morning, July 23rd, they moved against Scott's Club. On that warm, humid night, the establishment was hosting a party for several veterans, including 2 servicemen recently returned from the Vietnam War, and the bar's patrons were reluctant to leave the air-conditioned club. Out in the street, a crowd began to gather as police waited for vehicles to take the 85 patrons away. An hour passed before the last person was taken away, and by then, about 200 onlookers lined the street. A bottle crashed into the street. The remaining police ignored it, but then more bottles were thrown, including one through the window of a patrol car. The police fled as a small riot erupted. Within an hour, thousands of people had spilled out onto the street from nearby buildings. Looting began on 12th Street, and closed shops and businesses were ramshacked. Around 6:30 a.m., the first fire broke out, and soon much of the street was ablaze. By mid-morning, every policeman and fireman in Detroit was called to duty. On 12th Street, officers fought to control the unruly mob. Firemen were attacked as they tried to battle the flames. Detroit Mayor Jerome P. Kavanaugh asked Missioner Governor George Romney to send in the state police, but these 300 additional officers could not keep the riot from spreading to a 100-block area around Virginia Park. The National Guard was called in shortly after, but didn't arrive until the evening. By the end of Sunday, more than 1,000 people were arrested, but the riot kept spreading and intensifying. 5 people had died by Sunday night. On Monday, the rioting continued and 16 people were killed, most by police and guardsmen. Snipers reportedly fired at firemen, and fire hoses were cut. Governor Romney asked President Lyndon B. Johnson to send in the U.S. troops. Nearly 2,000 Army paratroopers arrived on Tuesday and began patrolling the streets of Detroit in tanks and armored carriers. 10 more people died that day and 12 more on Wednesday. On Thursday, July 27th, order was finally restored. More than 7,000 people were arrested during the 4 days of rioting. A total of 43 people were killed. Some 1,700 stores were looted and nearly 1,400 buildings burned, causing roughly $50 million in property damage. Some 5,000 people were left homeless. Thank you for watching and taking the time to uncover the harsh truth of these historical events. These riots, the why, when, where, who, and how, serve as a powerful reminder of a history that shaped the lives of our generations. The violence, injustice, and hate that fueled these moments of terror are not just relics of the past. Even today, 2024 and 2025, we continue to see the echoes of these tragedies in police brutality, racial discrimination, and systematic hate that persist in the United States. It is up to us to stay informed, speak up, and demand change. Let these stories remind us of the works that still need to be done. If this message resonated with you, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into our history as it impacts our present. Today, we can keep these conversations alive and push towards a better future. Thank you again. I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace and love, family.